February 14th, 2:47 a.m. A woman runs barefoot through freezing rain, clutching a dying infant against her chest. Behind her, a mansion worth $42 million stands dark and silent. Ahead of her, nothing but a mile-long driveway and the faint glow of streetlights she may never reach. In her arms, the baby has stopped breathing for the second time. She knows CPR. She knows the signs. She also knows that if this child dies tonight, she will be blamed for it. What she doesn't know yet is that someone in that house wanted exactly this to happen. And the person who tried to kill this innocent child, it's someone no one would ever suspect. This is the true story of Elena Martinez, a 31-year-old housekeeper from El Paso, Texas, and the night that turned her from an invisible employee into a national headline. But this isn't a story about heroism, at least not the kind you'd expect, because when the police arrived that night, they didn't treat Elena like a savior. They treated her like a suspect. And for 72 hours, the entire country believed she had tried to kidnap the son of one of America's wealthiest men. The truth, when it finally came out, was so much worse than anyone imagined. It involved a deadly secret, hidden for over a decade, a family torn apart by greed, and a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of corporate America. But most shocking of all? The person responsible had been living under the same roof as that baby for 2 years, watching him suffer, waiting for the perfect moment to finish what they started. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. My mom said I can't reach 1,000 subscribers. Let's prove her wrong. Elena Martinez never imagined she'd end up working in a place like Riverside Estate. Growing up in a 2-bedroom apartment in El Paso with 5 siblings, she learned early that life wasn't fair, but it could be survived if you kept your head down and worked hard. Her mother cleaned office buildings at night. Her father fixed cars in their driveway for cash. Elena got her first job at 14, babysitting for neighbors who paid her $5 an hour. She was good at it. Kids liked her because she actually listened to them, didn't just park them in front of screens. By the time she was 23, she'd worked her way through community college while nannying for 3 different families. She had a gift for understanding children, for reading their needs before they even cried. But life had a way of testing that gift in the cruelest way possible. In 2019, Elena gave birth to a son, a beautiful baby boy she named Gabriel. For 6 months, he was her entire world. Then came the fevers, the seizures, the hospital visits that drained her savings and left her drowning in medical debt. The doctors ran every test they could think of: genetic screenings, MRIs, metabolic panels. Gabriel had a rare mitochondrial disorder, they finally told her, something that affected maybe 1 in 10,000 children. There was no cure, only management. Expensive management. Elena worked 3 jobs trying to keep up with his medical bills, but it wasn't enough. On a Tuesday morning in March 2020, just as the pandemic was shutting down the world, Gabriel stopped breathing in his sleep. He was 7 months old. The grief hollowed her out so completely that for a year afterward, she could barely function. She stopped working, stopped eating regularly. Her family worried she might not recover. It wasn't until her sister practically dragged her to a grief counselor that Elena slowly began putting herself back together. The counselor told her something that stuck. Your pain doesn't have to be meaningless. You learn things taking care of Gabriel that most people will never know. You can use that to help other children. So in late 2021, Elena started looking for nanny positions again, even though the thought of caring for someone else's healthy child felt like pressing on a bruise that would never heal. That's when she found the listing for the Whitmore estate. The job description was strange. They wanted someone with medical knowledge, someone who could handle emergencies, someone who didn't mind living on site in a separate cottage on the property. The pay was exceptional, almost too good, $65,000 a year, plus room and board. Elena applied, not expecting anything. 2 days later, she got a call from a woman named Patricia Whitmore, the head of household for one of Connecticut's wealthiest families. They wanted to interview her immediately. The Whitmores, Elena learned, were American royalty in the business world. James Whitmore had built his empire from a single software startup in the 90s, growing it into a tech conglomerate worth billions. His wife, Catherine, had died 2 years earlier in what the media called a tragic accident, a fall down the main staircase of their home. Since then, James had become increasingly reclusive, running his empire from behind closed doors while raising their son, a 2-year-old named Oliver, essentially alone. Well, not quite alone. He had his sister, Margaret Whitmore Chen, living in the east wing of the mansion. Margaret had moved in shortly after Catherine's death, supposedly to help with the baby and to support her grieving brother. The household also included Patricia, who'd worked for the family for 20 years, a rotating staff of housekeepers who came during the day, and a private security team that monitored the property 24/7. When Elena arrived for her interview, she was overwhelmed by the scale of everything. The main house had 14 bedrooms, an indoor pool, a library that looked like something from a movie, and grounds that stretched over 12 acres. Patricia met her at the side entrance, a stern woman in her 60s who looked Elena up and down with obvious skepticism. "They don't usually hire people like you," Patricia said flatly, as she led Elena through a service corridor. "People like me?" Elena asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "People without references from other wealthy families," Patricia clarified. But Mr. Whitmore specifically requested someone with medical training, someone who understands pediatric emergencies. Elena's heart skipped. She hadn't mentioned Gabriel in her application, only her CPR certification and the emergency response training she'd completed while working at a daycare. Did they somehow know? Patricia led her to a formal sitting room where James Whitmore was waiting. He was younger than Elena expected, maybe late 30s, with dark circles under his eyes and an air of exhaustion that seemed bone deep. He barely looked at her during the interview. "Tell me about your experience with sick children," he said, his voice flat. Elena hesitated, then decided on honesty. "I had a son who passed away from a rare genetic condition," she said quietly. "I learned how to recognize the early signs of distress, how to manage seizures, how to keep detailed medical logs. I know what it's like when every second counts." For the first time, James looked directly at her. "Oliver has episodes," he said. "The doctors call them unexplained. Fever spikes, breathing difficulties. They've run every test. They can't find anything wrong, but it keeps happening. I need someone who won't panic, someone who knows what to look for." Elena got the job that same day. The first month at Riverside Estate was strange. Elena lived in a renovated cottage at the edge of the property, a space that was nicer than any apartment she'd ever rented. Her days followed a strict routine. She'd arrive at the main house at 7 a.m., take over Oliver's care from the night nurse who Patricia would dismiss, and spend the next 12 hours keeping the toddler fed, entertained, and safe. Oliver was a quiet child, unnervingly so. He didn't babble much, didn't run around like other 2-year-olds. He'd sit for long stretches, just staring out windows, as if he were waiting for something. Elena's maternal instincts kicked in hard. She started reading to him, singing songs her mother used to sing to her, introducing him to finger paints and building blocks. Slowly, Oliver began to open up. He'd smile when she entered the room, reach for her when he was scared. Within weeks, he was calling her Lena, unable to quite wrap his mouth around her full name. It broke her heart and healed it at the same time. But while her bond with Oliver grew stronger, her relationship with the rest of the household remained tense. Patricia watched her constantly, making notes on a small pad she carried everywhere. The daytime housekeepers, 2 Polish women named Marta and Anya, barely spoke to her. And Margaret, James's sister, was openly hostile. Margaret was 42, a former model who'd married into serious money before divorcing and moving back into her brother's life. She was beautiful in that sharp, expensive way, with platinum blonde hair and a wardrobe that probably cost more than Elena's car. She also seemed to resent Elena's presence intensely. Elena first noticed it during Oliver's bath time. She was kneeling by the tub, carefully washing the toddler's hair, when Margaret appeared in the doorway. "You're getting awfully attached," Margaret said, her voice dripping with something Elena couldn't quite identify. "I'm just doing my job," Elena replied evenly. Margaret smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Catherine used to give him baths. Did you know that? Every single night, no matter how tired she was." "I'm sure she did," Elena said carefully. "I'm not trying to replace anyone." Margaret's expression hardened. "Of course you're not. You couldn't, if you tried." Then she turned and left, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. After that encounter, Elena started noticing other things. The way Margaret would stand outside Oliver's room at odd hours, just watching. How she'd rearrange things in the nursery after Elena had organized them. The strange questions she'd ask, like whether Elena had family nearby, or if anyone knew where she was working. Patricia noticed Elena's discomfort. "Don't mind Miss Margaret," she said one afternoon while they were folding laundry. "She's been through a lot." Losing her sister-in-law was hard on her. "They were close?" Elena asked. Patricia's expression flickered with something, doubt maybe, or suspicion. "They were family," she said simply, which wasn't really an answer at all. The real trouble started in January, about 3 months after Elena began working there. Oliver had his first major episode on her watch. It was a Tuesday evening. James was working late in his home office, and Margaret had driven into Manhattan for some charity event. Elena was reading Oliver a bedtime story when she noticed his skin looked flushed. She touched his forehead. He was burning up. Within minutes, his temperature had spiked to 104 degrees. Then he started convulsing. Elena's training kicked in immediately. She laid him on his side, supported his head, and started timing the seizure while calling for help on the intercom system. Patricia arrived first, face pale, followed by James, who'd sprinted from his office. The private doctor, who was on retainer for the family, arrived within 20 minutes. By then, Elena had gotten Oliver's fever down with cool compresses and carefully administered children's acetaminophen. The seizure had stopped after 90 seconds. The doctor examined Oliver thoroughly, ran some quick tests, and came up with nothing conclusive. "Probably just a febrile seizure," he said, "common in toddlers." But James looked haunted. "This is the 5th time," he said quietly. 5 times in 4 months, and nobody can tell me why." Elena filed the incident in her detailed log, noting everything: the time, Oliver's symptoms, what he'd eaten that day, the temperature of the room, anything that might help identify a pattern. She'd learned to do this with Gabriel, tracking every variable in desperate hope of understanding his condition. It had never saved him, but maybe it could save Oliver. Over the next month, Elena started noticing things that didn't add up. Oliver's episodes seemed to happen on a schedule, roughly every 2 weeks, always in the evening, always when Margaret was either out or in a different part of the house. The medical team couldn't find any underlying cause. His genetic testing came back clean. His metabolic panels were normal. It was as if his body was reacting to something external, but no one could figure out what. Elena started keeping her own observations separate from the official log. She noted what Oliver ate, but also who prepared his food. She tracked when his medications were given and by whom. James had mentioned that Oliver took a daily probiotic for his digestion and a liquid vitamin supplement. Both were kept in the kitchen, administered by whoever was doing the morning routine. Usually Patricia, sometimes Margaret. If Patricia had the day off, occasionally Elena herself. One evening, Elena was putting away groceries when she noticed Oliver's vitamin bottle had been moved from its usual spot in the cabinet to the counter. The seal was broken, even though she'd just opened a new bottle 2 days ago. She picked it up, examined it. The liquid inside looked slightly different, cloudier than usual. She mentioned it to Patricia. "Oh, Miss Margaret must have given him his dose early today," Patricia said. "She does that sometimes when I'm running behind." Elena felt a chill run down her spine, but couldn't articulate why. She was just being paranoid, she told herself. Grief and trauma made you see threats everywhere. But that night, Oliver had another episode. And this time, Elena noticed something she'd missed before. There was a faint smell on his breath, something bitter and chemical, something that reminded her of the hospital. She started researching obsessively in her cottage at night. Medications that could cause seizures, substances that would metabolize quickly and leave no trace, poisons that mimicked natural illness. What she found terrified her. There were dozens of pharmaceutical compounds that could produce Oliver's exact symptoms if given in small, regular doses. Things that would be nearly impossible to detect without knowing specifically what to test for. And they were all things that someone with medical knowledge would know about. Someone who'd been around Catherine when she died. Someone who had access to Oliver's food and medications every single day. Elena knew she was treading into dangerous territory. These weren't the kind of accusations you made lightly, especially not against someone as powerful as Margaret Whitmore Chen. She had no proof, just instinct and pattern recognition. The same instinct that had told her something was wrong with Gabriel before the doctors figured it out. The same instinct she'd learned to trust because it was all she had. She decided to install a small camera in Oliver's room, one of those basic nanny cams you could buy online for $30. She positioned it on a shelf between stuffed animals, angled to cover the crib and the door. She didn't tell anyone. If she was wrong, she'd delete the footage and never mention it. If she was right, she needed evidence before she went to James. 3 days later, the camera caught something. It was 2 in the morning. Elena was asleep in her cottage when the motion sensor on her phone alerted her that someone had entered Oliver's room. She opened the app and watched the grainy night vision footage. A figure moved quietly to Oliver's crib. The person was wearing a robe, and even in the poor lighting, Elena could see platinum blonde hair. Margaret stood over the sleeping toddler for a long moment, then reached into her pocket and pulled out what looked like a small syringe. Elena's blood ran cold. She watched as Margaret carefully held Oliver's mouth open and squeezed a few drops of clear liquid onto his tongue. The toddler stirred, but didn't wake. Margaret stroked his hair almost tenderly, whispered something Elena couldn't hear, then left the room as quietly as she'd entered. Elena was shaking so hard she could barely hold her phone. She wanted to call the police immediately, but a voice in her head warned her to think this through. Margaret was a Whitmore. She had lawyers, money, connections. If Elena accused her without ironclad proof, she'd be destroyed. She needed more than one night of footage. She needed to understand why. So Elena waited, keeping the camera rolling, watching the footage every morning. And over the next 2 weeks, she caught Margaret entering Oliver's room 4 more times. Always at night. Always with the syringe. Always administering those drops while Oliver slept. On the nights Margaret visited, Oliver would have an episode the next evening. On the nights she didn't, he was fine. The pattern was undeniable. Elena started making copies of everything. The footage, her logs, medical records she wasn't supposed to have access to, but had photographed with her phone during late shifts when Patricia left files out. She created a backup drive and mailed it to her sister in El Paso with instructions to open it only if something happened to Elena. She knew she was being watched more closely now. Patricia's questions became sharper. Margaret's hostility grew more overt. Even James seemed suspicious, asking Elena odd questions about her past, where her family lived, whether she'd signed a non-disclosure agreement. Then on February 13th, everything accelerated. Elena was in the kitchen preparing Oliver's dinner when Margaret walked in. They were alone, which was rare. The rest of the staff had gone home for the evening, and James was on a business call in his study. Margaret poured herself a glass of wine and watched Elena work. "You know, Elena," Margaret said casually, "I've been thinking about how attached you are to Oliver." Elena kept cutting vegetables, didn't look up. "I care about his well-being," she said carefully. "That's my job." Margaret laughed, a brittle sound. "Your job. Right. And what happens when your job ends? When James decides Oliver doesn't need a nanny anymore? Where will you go? Back to El Paso, I imagine. Back to your sad little life." Elena's hands stilled on the knife. "Is there something specific you want to say to me?" Margaret's expression hardened. "I'm saying you should be careful. People like you, people who get too close to families like ours, they sometimes have accidents. You wouldn't want that." Elena finally looked at her. "Are you threatening me?" Margaret smiled. "I'm protecting what's mine. This family, this house, everything in it." Catherine understood that. She knew her place. Then she forgot, and look what happened to her. The implication hung in the air like poison. Elena's mind raced. Catherine's death, the one everyone called an accident. What if it hadn't been? What if Margaret had been doing this for longer than anyone realized? Before Elena could respond, Oliver started crying from the playroom. The moment broke. Margaret finished her wine and left, and Elena stood there, trying to process what had just been said. That night, Elena barely slept. She kept checking the camera feed, watching Margaret's door, waiting for her to make a move. But Margaret stayed in her room all night. It was the next evening, Valentine's Day, when everything fell apart. Elena was giving Oliver his bath when the lights went out. Not just in the bathroom, but in the entire house. The backup generators, which should have kicked in immediately, didn't activate. Elena heard shouting from somewhere downstairs. James's voice, Patricia responding. Then silence. Elena quickly dried Oliver off and wrapped him in a towel, her heart hammering. Something was very wrong. She tried her phone. No signal, which was impossible because Riverside Estate had cell boosters installed throughout the property. She tried the intercom. Dead. She was heading toward Oliver's room to get him dressed when she heard footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate footsteps. "Elena," a voice called. It was Margaret, and she sounded strange. "Elena, I know you're up here. We need to talk about Oliver." Elena backed into Oliver's room and locked the door, her hands shaking. Through the door, she could hear Margaret getting closer. "Why are you hiding?" Margaret's voice was sing-song now, almost playful. "You can't keep him from me. He's not even yours. He should have been mine." Elena looked around frantically. The room had no other exit. The window overlooked a 30-foot drop to the garden. Her phone still had no signal. And Oliver, sensing her fear, started to cry. Margaret began pounding on the door. "Open this door right now, Elena. Open it!" Elena made a decision. She wrapped Oliver in a blanket, grabbed the diaper bag that she always kept stocked with emergency supplies, and opened the window. There was a trellis running down the side of the house, installed years ago for climbing roses. It looked sturdy enough. It had to be. She climbed out first, holding Oliver against her chest with one arm while gripping the trellis with the other. Behind her, she heard the door burst open. Margaret's scream of rage echoed into the night. Elena climbed down as fast as she dared, her bare feet finding purchase on the wood slats. She was halfway down when the trellis started pulling away from the wall. She dropped the last 10 feet, landing hard in a flower bed, managing to twist her body so Oliver wouldn't take the impact. Pain shot through her ankle, but she forced herself up and started running. The estate's front gates were a mile away. She couldn't risk going back to her cottage for shoes or keys. She just ran, holding Oliver tight, feeling the cold February rain that had started falling soak through her clothes. Behind her, lights blazed on in the mansion. She heard Margaret screaming for security, heard dogs barking, kept running. Elena's lungs burned as she sprinted down the long driveway, her bare feet slapping against the wet pavement. Oliver was crying hysterically now, terrified and confused, and Elena tried to soothe him while maintaining her pace. "It's okay, baby. It's okay. We're almost safe," she kept whispering, even though she had no idea if that was true. The estate's security lights flickered on in sequence as she ran, motion sensors tracking her progress. She knew the team monitored everything from a building near the main gate They'd see her. They'd stop her. Unless they were already dealing with whatever chaos Margaret had created inside the house. Elena's mind raced through possibilities. Had Margaret hurt James and Patricia? Was this a complete breakdown, or had Margaret been planning this moment for months? And what exactly was her endgame? The rain was coming down harder now, cold and punishing. Elena glanced down at Oliver, and her heart stopped. His lips were turning blue. "No, no, no, not now. Please, not now." She stopped running and knelt on the gravel, sheltering him from the rain with her body. His breathing was shallow and rapid. His eyes were rolling back. He was going into shock, either from fear or from whatever Margaret had been giving him, building up in his system. Elena ripped open the diaper bag with shaking hands. She always carried emergency supplies, including a pediatric EpiPen in case of allergic reactions and a small bottle of glucose gel for blood sugar crashes. She squeezed some of the gel into Oliver's mouth, massaging his throat to help him swallow. "Come on, Oliver, stay with me," she begged. His breathing didn't improve. If anything, it was getting worse. Elena made a calculation. She was still half a mile from the gate. Even if she made it there, security might not let her through. And she had maybe 5 minutes before Oliver's condition became critical. She needed help immediately. There was a groundskeeper's shed about 200 yards off the driveway. She remembered seeing it during her first week. It had a landline phone for estate maintenance calls. It was her only option. Elena picked up Oliver and ran toward the tree line, her injured ankle screaming with every step. She found the shed, a small wooden structure, almost invisible in the dark and rain. The door was locked, but the window wasn't. She smashed it with her elbow, ignoring the pain as glass cut her skin, and climbed through. Inside, she fumbled for a light switch. Nothing. The power was out here, too. She felt along the wall for the phone she remembered seeing, found it, lifted the receiver to her ear. Silence. The line was dead. Of course it was. Margaret had cut all communications. This was planned. Elena wanted to scream. Instead, she focused on Oliver. His breathing had become a terrible wheezing sound. She laid him on the floor and started infant CPR, tilting his head back to open his airway, giving gentle rescue breaths, watching his tiny chest rise and fall. 1 breath, 2 breaths. Check for pulse. Repeat. She'd done this before, in the horrible final minutes of Gabriel's life, and the muscle memory was so strong it made her want to vomit. But she kept going, because Oliver wasn't Gabrielle, and this child still had a chance. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably 90 seconds, Oliver coughed and started breathing more normally. Color returned to his lips. His eyes opened, unfocused but alive. Elena collapsed against the wall, crying with relief. That's when she heard the dogs. The estate had 3 German shepherds that the security team used for property sweeps. They were trained for tracking, and they were getting closer. Elena looked at Oliver. He was stable for now, but barely. She couldn't run anymore. Her ankle was swelling up, and she was starting to feel lightheaded from pain and adrenaline crash. She was trapped. Then she heard a voice calling her name, but it wasn't Margaret. It was James. "Elena, if you're out there, please, I need to know Oliver is safe." His voice was hoarse, desperate. "Elena, I know about the camera. I found the footage. I know everything." Elena's breath caught. He knew? James kept calling. "Margaret locked me in my study. Patricia managed to get me out. But Elena, the police are coming. Security called them. If you run, they'll think you kidnapped him. Please, just tell me where you are." Elena made a decision. She stumbled to the broken window and shouted into the night. "We're in the groundskeeper's shed. Oliver needs a hospital." Within minutes, flashlights converged on the shed. James reached her first, crashing through the door. His face crumpled when he saw Oliver in Elena's arms, alive but weak. "Thank God," he whispered, taking his son carefully. "Thank God." Behind him, Patricia appeared, followed by 2 security guards. Then flashing lights. Police cruisers were pulling up the driveway. An ambulance. James turned to the officers. "She saved my son," he said firmly. "She saved him from my sister. Whatever Margaret told you, it's a lie." The next 72 hours were chaos. Oliver was rushed to Connecticut Children's Medical Center in Hartford, where a team of specialists worked to stabilize him and identify what he'd been given. Elena was taken to the same hospital, treated for hypothermia, lacerations, and a fractured ankle, then immediately questioned by police. She handed over everything, the footage, her logs, the backup drive she'd mailed to her sister, which was already on its way back via overnight courier. James gave a statement corroborating everything and providing access to all of the estate's security footage from the past 6 months. The investigation moved quickly once the evidence was compiled. Toxicology reports showed Oliver had been given small, regular doses of syrup of ipecac, a medication once used to induce vomiting in poisoning cases, but now known to cause serious cardiac and neurological problems with repeated use. It explained all of his symptoms, the seizures, the breathing difficulties, the unexplained fevers. Margaret had been slowly poisoning her own nephew for months. When police searched Margaret's room, they found a stockpile of medications, syringes, medical journals, with sections highlighted about untraceable poisoning methods. They also found a journal, and what was written in it was worse than anyone imagined. Margaret's entries went back 3 years. They detailed her growing obsession with her brother's fortune and her resentment of Catherine. Catherine, who had everything Margaret wanted, the money, the beautiful child, the perfect life. Margaret's marriage had fallen apart. Her modeling career had ended. She'd come back to Riverside Estate feeling like a failure, forced to depend on her younger brother's charity. The journal made it clear that Catherine's death hadn't been an accident. Margaret had pushed her, creating a fall that looked like Catherine had simply slipped on the stairs. But killing Catherine hadn't given Margaret what she wanted. James had remained devoted to his dead wife's memory and to Oliver. So Margaret tried a different approach. If Oliver were to die, tragically, from the same mysterious condition that doctors couldn't diagnose, James would be broken, vulnerable, dependent on Margaret. And if he didn't recover? Well, as his only living relative, Margaret would inherit everything: the fortune, the company, the house, all of it. She'd tried to frame the previous nanny, creating situations that made the woman look incompetent until James fired her. Then Elena had arrived, and Margaret saw an opportunity. A poor woman with a dead child, someone the police would easily believe had a breakdown and hurt Oliver. Someone with no connections, no power, no one who would fight for her. But Elena had been smarter than Margaret anticipated. She documented everything, protected the child, ruined the perfect plan. The journal's final entry, written the morning of February 14th, was chilling. Tonight, it ends. One way or another. The media descended on the story like locusts. Billionaire's sister arrested for attempted murder. The poor nanny who saved an heir. Shocking betrayal in one of America's richest families. Elena's face was everywhere, in newspapers, on television, across social media. Some outlets painted her as a hero. Others questioned why she'd waited so long to come forward, suggesting she'd endangered Oliver by not reporting her suspicions immediately. The scrutiny was overwhelming. Elena couldn't leave the hospital without being mobbed by reporters. Her family in El Paso had journalists camped outside their home. Her sister had to take time off work because of the attention. Elena felt like she was drowning. James visited her on the third day. He looked like he'd aged a decade. Oliver was going to be okay, he told her. The doctors were confident he'd make a full recovery. Margaret was being held without bail. The prosecutor was charging her with attempted murder, child endangerment, and they were reopening the investigation into Catherine's death. James sat down heavily in the chair beside Elena's bed. "I owe you everything," he said quietly. "You saved my son's life. I hired you to protect him, and you did, even when it put you in danger." Elena didn't know what to say. She'd spent the last 3 days replaying every moment, wondering if she could have acted sooner. Saved Oliver from months of suffering if she'd just trusted her instincts earlier. "I should have told you as soon as I suspected something," she finally said. "I was afraid I was wrong." "You were protecting yourself," James said, "and I understand why. If you'd come to me with just suspicions, I might not have believed you. Margaret is my sister. I've known her my whole life. I never would have thought her capable of something like this." He paused. "The police told me about the backup drive you sent to your sister. That kind of thinking, that precaution, it saved this case. Without that evidence, Margaret's lawyers might have created reasonable doubt. You did everything right." Elena didn't feel like she'd done everything right. She felt exhausted, traumatized, and deeply sad. Sad for Oliver, who'd suffered because adults around him had failed to protect him. Sad for James, who'd lost his wife and sister to the same evil. Sad for Gabrielle, who she hadn't been able to save, no matter how hard she tried. And sad for herself, because this experience had ripped open wounds she'd spent years learning to live with. Margaret Whitmore Chen's trial began 4 months later, in June. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. They presented the security footage Elena had captured, showing Margaret entering Oliver's room multiple times and administering the syrup of ipecac. They brought in medical experts who testified about the effects of repeated ipecac poisoning and how it matched Oliver's symptoms perfectly. They entered Margaret's journal into evidence, letting the jury read her twisted thoughts in her own handwriting. The defense tried to argue that Margaret had been suffering from a mental breakdown, that years of depression and anxiety following her divorce had led to a psychotic break. They painted her as a victim of circumstance, someone who'd lost touch with reality and didn't fully understand what she was doing. They claimed Catherine's death had been an accident, that Margaret, in her confused state, had misremembered as intentional. The prosecution destroyed that narrative. They showed that Margaret had been carefully, methodically, researching poisoning methods for over a year, that she'd ordered the ipecac online using a fake name, that she'd maintained her normal life, attending charity events and managing her finances, while simultaneously plotting her nephew's death. This wasn't mental illness. This was premeditated, attempted murder. Elena was called to testify on the fourth day of the trial. She'd been dreading it, knowing she'd have to face Margaret in court, but she also knew her testimony was crucial. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Rachel Vance, walked her through everything: her hiring, her growing attachment to Oliver, the episodes she'd witnessed, her decision to install the camera, the night she ran with Oliver through the rain. Margaret's defense attorney, a man named Harrison Boyd, who'd made his career defending white-collar criminals, tried to paint Elena as an unreliable witness. "Isn't it true, Ms. Martinez, that you've suffered from depression and anxiety following the death of your son?" he asked. "Yes," Elena answered steadily. "And isn't it true that you were on medication for those conditions when you started working for the Whitmore family?" "I was on a low dose of an SSRI," Elena said. "Many people are. It didn't affect my ability to do my job." Boyd pressed harder. "But you admit you have a history of trauma related to sick children. Is it possible that this trauma caused you to misinterpret innocent actions by Ms. Whitmore? Is it possible you saw something sinister because you were projecting your own past experiences onto the situation?" Elena looked directly at the jury. "I didn't misinterpret anything," she said. "I watched that woman poison a child for months. I documented everything because I knew people would try to discredit me. And when Oliver started dying in my arms that night, I didn't think about my past or my trauma. I thought about saving him, because that's what you do when a child needs you." The courtroom was silent. Boyd tried a few more questions, but couldn't shake her testimony. Rachel Vance's redirect was simple. "Ms. Martinez, if you hadn't installed that camera, if you hadn't kept those detailed logs, if you hadn't run with Oliver that night, what do you think would have happened?" Elena's voice was quiet but firm. Oliver would be dead, and Margaret would have gotten away with murder. Again. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They found Margaret Whitmore Chen guilty on all counts: attempted murder, child endangerment. And in a separate proceeding, she was charged with Catherine Whitmore's murder based on new evidence and her own journal admissions. The judge sentenced her to 40 years to life in prison. As the verdict was read, Margaret showed no emotion. She didn't cry or react. She just stared straight ahead. And for a moment, Elena saw something in her eyes that made her deeply sad. It wasn't remorse. It was emptiness. Here was a woman who'd had everything: wealth, beauty, connections. And it had never been enough. Her envy had consumed her so completely that she'd destroyed her own family and ruined her life. After the trial, Elena expected to feel relief. Instead, she felt hollow. Justice had been served, but it didn't erase what had happened. It didn't give Catherine her life back, or give Oliver those months of health he'd lost. It didn't heal the trauma of that night. The media attention began to fade, as it always does. New scandals emerged to capture the public's attention. Elena's story became old news. She tried to return to normal life, but normal had fundamentally changed. She couldn't go back to being just a nanny. Everywhere she went, people recognized her. Some wanted to take selfies with her. Others whispered behind her back. Potential employers were nervous about the attention she'd bring. Her therapy sessions intensified. She worked through layers of trauma, not just from the Whitmore case, but from Gabriel's death, from years of feeling powerless and invisible as a low-income worker in a world that didn't value people like her. 6 months after the trial, James Whitmore reached out to Elena. They'd barely spoken since the verdict, both needing space to process everything. He asked if they could meet for coffee. Elena agreed, curious. They met at a quiet cafe in New Haven, far enough from Riverside Estate to feel neutral. James looked better than he had during the trial. There was color in his face again, and when he smiled at Oliver, who he'd brought along in a stroller, it reached his eyes. Oliver had recovered physically, his doctors confirming no lasting damage from the poisoning. Emotionally, he was a happy, energetic 3-year-old who had no memory of the worst parts of what happened to him. James told Elena he'd sold Riverside Estate. He couldn't live there anymore, not with Catherine's ghost and Margaret's crimes haunting every hallway. He'd bought a smaller house in Vermont, something manageable and warm, a place where Oliver could have a normal childhood. He'd also stepped back from running his company day to day, appointing a CEO he trusted while he focused on being a present father. "I wanted to thank you again," James said. "And I wanted to ask you something." Elena waited. "I've set up a foundation in Catherine's name," he said. "It's focused on protecting children from abuse and supporting people who report it. I want you to run it." Elena was shocked. She opened her mouth to protest, to say she wasn't qualified, but James held up a hand. "You're the most qualified person I know," he said. "You understand what it's like to be powerless. You know how the system fails people who don't have money or connections. And you have the moral courage to do what's right even when it's terrifying. That's exactly who should be leading this work." Elena thought about it for a long time. She'd spent her entire life feeling like she was one crisis away from losing everything. The idea of having stability, of doing meaningful work, of turning the worst experience of her life into something that could help others, it was overwhelming. But it also felt right. She accepted. The Catherine Whitmore Foundation launched in January, exactly a year after the night Elena ran through the rain with Oliver. The foundation provided legal support for whistleblowers in abuse cases, funded programs to train mandatory reporters, and created a scholarship fund for low-income workers pursuing careers in child advocacy. Elena threw herself into the work. She hired a small team of people who'd experienced similar situations, people who understood how hard it was to speak up against powerful abusers. They worked with legislators to strengthen protections for domestic workers who reported abuse. They partnered with hospitals to improve protocols for identifying signs of poisoning in children. They funded research into long-term outcomes for children who survived abuse. The work was hard and often heartbreaking, but it mattered. Elena gave talks at universities and conferences, sharing her story and advocating for systemic change. She was nervous at first, uncomfortable with public speaking, but she found her voice. People listened. Survivors reached out to share their own stories. Legislators cited her testimony when passing new laws. Slowly, she began to see the impact. Lives being saved because someone recognized the signs. Abusers being held accountable because victims had legal protection and support. It didn't erase what happened, but it gave it meaning. 3 years after the trial, Elena received a letter. It was from Margaret. Elena almost threw it away without opening it, but curiosity won. The letter was short. Margaret wrote that she'd been in therapy in prison, working through her issues with a psychiatrist. She claimed to understand now that what she'd done was evil, that her jealousy and sense of entitlement had made her into a monster. She said she thought about Catherine and Oliver every day. She said she was sorry. Elena read the letter twice, then filed it away. She didn't respond. Maybe Margaret was genuinely remorseful. Maybe this was just another manipulation. Either way, Elena didn't owe her forgiveness. Some things were beyond apology. What she'd learned through therapy was that healing didn't require forgiving people who'd harmed you. It required building a life where their actions no longer defined you. Margaret had tried to destroy her, to frame her as a criminal, and take away the child she'd been protecting. But Elena was still here, still fighting, still making a difference. That was victory enough. Oliver turned 6. James sent Elena photos from his birthday party, a small gathering with a few school friends, nothing like the elaborate events the Whitmores used to host. In the pictures, Oliver was laughing, covered in frosting from his dinosaur cake, completely and beautifully normal. That's what it was all for, Elena thought. That laugh, that chance at a regular childhood. She kept one of the photos on her desk at the foundation office, a reminder of why she did this work. On difficult days, when she was dealing with bureaucracy or heartbreaking cases or her own trauma resurfacing, she'd look at that picture and remember. One child saved was worth everything. People often ask Elena if she regrets taking the job at Riverside Estate. If she wishes she'd never gotten involved with the Whitmore family. Her answer is complicated. She wishes Oliver had never suffered. She wishes Catherine were still alive. She wishes Gabriel had survived, and that she'd never had to learn the things she learned while caring for him. But regret? No, because if she hadn't taken that job, Oliver would be dead. Margaret would have succeeded, and Elena would still be adrift, working minimum-wage nanny jobs and feeling like her son's death had been meaningless. The experience broke her in some ways. She still has nightmares about that night, about running through the rain, about Oliver's lips turning blue. She has panic attacks sometimes when she sees syringes or when she hears children crying in distress. Her therapist tells her that's PTSD, and she's learning to manage it. But the experience also gave her purpose. It showed her that the worst moments of our lives can become the foundation for meaningful change. That surviving trauma doesn't mean forgetting it. It means using it. Elena thinks about Gabriel every day. She visits his grave once a month, bringing flowers and telling him about the work she's doing. She likes to imagine he knows somehow that wherever he is, he's proud that his short life taught her how to save another child, that his suffering wasn't for nothing. On the 5th anniversary of the night she saved Oliver, a journalist asked Elena what she wanted people to understand about her story. Elena thought carefully before answering. I want people to understand that abuse doesn't always look like what you expect, she said. It doesn't always come from strangers or obvious villains. Sometimes it comes from family members, from people in positions of power, from places where you're told everything is fine. And I want people to know that if you see something, if your instincts tell you a child is in danger, you have to act, even if you're scared, even if you think no one will believe you, even if it costs you everything, because that child's life depends on someone being brave enough to speak up. The journalist asked if she considered herself a hero. Elena shook her head. I'm not a hero, she said. "I'm just someone who paid attention, who trusted her instincts, who loved a child enough to protect him when no one else would. That's not heroism. That's basic humanity. But we live in a world where basic humanity sometimes requires extraordinary courage, and that's what needs to change. The Foundation has helped over 2,000 children in 5 years. That's 2,000 lives impacted, 2,000 families given the support they needed to escape abuse or report it safely. Elena knows it's not enough. There are still countless children suffering in silence, still abusers who never face consequences, still systems that fail the most vulnerable. But it's something, and something is where change begins. Elena rebuilt her life piece by piece. She dated again, cautiously, and eventually met someone, a social worker named Marcus, who understood trauma and didn't expect her to be anything other than who she was. They got married in a small ceremony with just family and close friends. No media, no spectacle, just love. She reconnected with her family in El Paso, visiting regularly and helping her younger siblings pay for college through the Foundation's scholarship program. She bought her mother a house, something her mother cried over for an hour when Elena handed her the keys. It was paid for with honest money, from honest work, and it felt good. On quiet evenings, Elena sometimes wonders what her life would have been like if she'd never met the Whitmores, if she'd taken a different job that January, if she'd ignored her instincts about Margaret, if she'd run slower that night and Oliver had died in her arms. The sliding doors of fate and chance. But she's learned not to dwell on what-ifs. This is the life she has, the scars she carries, the purpose she found, and somehow, improbably, she's become someone who helps others find their way through darkness. The last time Elena saw Oliver in person was at his 8th birthday party. James had invited her, and she'd debated whether to go. Their lives had moved in different directions. The trial and everything surrounding it had bonded them in trauma, but they'd both needed to step away from those memories to heal. Still, she wanted to see Oliver, wanted to know he was okay. The party was in James's backyard in Vermont. Nothing fancy, just kids running around playing tag, while adults stood in clusters talking and watching. Oliver was taller now, his baby face gone, replaced by the features of a boy who'd grow into a handsome man someday. He was confident, loud, totally unself-conscious as he played with his friends. He had no idea what he'd survived. James had decided not to tell him yet, wanting to give him a few more years of innocence first. Someday, Oliver would learn about his mother's murder, about his aunt's attempt to kill him, about the maid who'd saved his life. But today, he was just a kid at a birthday party. Oliver saw Elena and ran over. "You're Lena," he said, excited. "Dad said you might come." Elena crouched down to his level. "Happy birthday, Oliver," he grinned. "Thanks. Do you want to see my new bike?" She spent an hour there, watching Oliver show off his bike tricks, eating cake, talking quietly with James about foundation work and his life in Vermont. It was normal and peaceful, and when Elena left, she felt something she hadn't expected. Closure. This child would be okay. He had a father who loved him, a therapist who helped him process the vague memories he did have, a safe home, a chance. That was all any child deserved. That was what Elna fought for every day. As she drove back to Connecticut, Elena thought about how to answer the question people always asked. Was it worth it? The trauma, the danger, the permanent changes to her life? and she realized the question itself was wrong. It wasn't about worth. It was about necessity. When you see a child in danger, you don't calculate cost-benefit. You don't weigh your own safety against theirs. You act, because children don't have the power to protect themselves from adult monsters. They need us to be their shield, to be their voice, to be willing to risk everything for them. Elena hadn't chosen to be a hero. She'd chosen to be human, to care when it would have been easier not to act when staying silent would have been safer, to love a child who wasn't hers and protect him like he was. That's the real story. Not about good versus evil or rich versus poor, though those dynamics played their part. It's about what we owe to the most vulnerable among us, about the responsibility we all carry to protect children, whether they're ours or not, about speaking up even when our voice shakes, about trusting our instincts when something feels wrong, about being brave enough to stand between a child and harm, even when the harm comes from places we never expected. Elena still has days where the weight of everything feels crushing, where she remembers Margaret's hands hovering over Oliver's crib and feels sick, where she wakes up from nightmares about Gabriel and can't shake the grief for hours. But she also has days where she gets a letter from a family the foundation helped, where she sees legislation pass that will protect more children, where she looks at that photo of Oliver laughing at his birthday party. And those days remind her why surviving was worth it, why fighting was necessary, why refusing to be silenced or scared into compliance was the only option. She carries Gabriel's memory and Oliver's survival with her everywhere. They've shaped who she is and what she fights for, and she'll carry that responsibility for the rest of her life, not as a burden, but as a privilege, because some children don't get a second chance. Some don't get someone who notices. Some don't get saved. But Oliver did, and that matters. That will always matter. So, I want to ask you something. If you'd been in Elena's position that night, holding a dying child, with danger closing in around you, what would you have done? Would you have run like she did? Or would fear have frozen you in place? Would you have trusted your instincts the way she did when she first suspected something was wrong? Or would you have talked yourself out of it? Told yourself you were being paranoid? That powerful people, like Margaret, couldn't possibly be capable of such evil. And here's the harder question. If you saw signs of abuse in your own life, in a neighbor's home, at a relative's house, at a school or daycare, would you speak up? Would you make that call to child services, even knowing it might be wrong, might cause conflict, might make you the villain in someone else's story? Because that's what this story is really about. Not about the drama or the suspense or the shocking twists. It's about the choice we all face when we suspect a child is in danger. The choice between involvement and indifference, between courage and convenience, between acting and assuming someone else will handle it. Elena made her choice. She acted. She risked everything. And because of that, a child is alive today who wouldn't be otherwise. What choice will you make when your moment comes? Because it will come. Maybe not in such dramatic fashion. Maybe it'll be quieter, subtler. But at some point, you'll see something that doesn't feel right. You'll have that nagging instinct, and you'll have to decide whether to trust it. I hope when that moment comes, you'll remember Elena's story. Remember that speaking up can save a life. And that sometimes The most important thing we ever do is pay attention when it would be easier to look away. Thank you for watching this documentary. If this story moved you or made you think, please share it. And if you've experienced something similar, if you've survived abuse or spoken up for a child in danger, know that your courage matters. You matter. And there are people fighting every day to make sure children have the protection they deserve. My mom said I can't reach 1,000 subscribers. Let's prove her wrong.